Hello everyone, my name is Nasi Alam.
And I am Joel Whitfield.
And we are the co-founders of I Am Perspective, and we are recording another episode of our I Am Perspective podcast.
Well, season 3 of our I Am Perspective podcast, which used to be I Am Perspective Radio. And our I Am Perspective Radio kicked off in 2020 during a crazy time called the pandemic, which is what our episode today is all about.
Yes, the pandemic. That crazy time period that we're still kind of living in right now, but we don't seem to really talk about for some reason.
Yeah, and we're coming to you today from my home, from my couch, and I said I was gonna wear a hoodie so I could feel as comfortable as possible to have this conversation, because you're right, like we don't have this conversation at all. And Nussie and I were experts at conversation. We've been doing conversations via virtual, in-person, schools, all over.
I mean, we really started out in person, wanting to get away from the computer.
Right.
And we were doing it for over 2 years. We over 100 events before going to 2020, and then we had to shift into virtual, just like everything else. So let's kind of maybe start off with that, like the last days of this old world that we were living in.
What was it like for you, wherever you were at, if you're watching us? Where were you at? Let's just take a moment to kind of reflect, because again, this is not something that we can ignore. We're watching it play out with adults. We're watching it play out with our children. We work in this New York school system, and this isn't going anywhere. So we're taking this time to reflect and kind of speak on some things, not to ruffle feathers and things, but to address.
Maybe. But maybe.
I act like I don't want to, but maybe we need to.
Maybe we need to. No, I mean, you know, we always kind of talk about 9/11 as New Yorkers, and everyone has a story of where they were when, you know, it all went down. And, you know, for Jarrell and I, we are very clear of when things started shifting in New York and where we were when we found out that the first part, Rochester actually, New Rochelle.
Yeah, so where were we at? What was going on?
We were sitting at a coffee shop getting ready to go to our radio station actually to record another episode of our podcast. So we were sitting at the coffee shop in Brooklyn ready to go record our next episode with Lucinda Cross, and she was coming in from New Rochelle, and she had already texted me to let me know that she was on the way. And so we're sitting there, we're just kind of preparing our questions and, you know, getting ourselves ready for this conversation we were about to have, which was really about life after prison, right? Yeah. And all of a sudden she's texting me and she's like, they're not going to let me out. They're telling us that we're going into lockdown. And so we're just like, lockdown? Like, what's going on? And I don't think this is even in the news yet, right? Like, we were just getting this call because she happened to be trying to leave New Rochelle to come to us for this radio show.
Yeah, so we got this super inside intel where we feel like we were the first people in the city almost to know what was happening, because again, it happened from New Rochelle into the city.
Yeah, and so then, you know, she was still graceful enough to have this conversation with us. She called in. We were at the radio station. We do have that. We'll post a link for you all so you can check that one out. And it was a different kind of conversation, but it was also like we were about to have a conversation about her coming out of prison and living this amazing lifestyle and doing so much good for people, and now being told she has to be locked up again in a type of way, right? And you know, with us knowing that it's probably gonna come to us soon too, right? Like, I don't know. I know the whole nation was not under quarantine, but here in New York, we were about to go into that as well.
Yeah, that's when we first heard about it, we heard about it as quarantine, you know, from that call from New Rochelle. They were putting them in quarantine.
Yeah.
And I spoke with a lot of people, we spoke with a lot of people around the country during this time, and not everybody was in quarantine. And, you know, New Yorkers get a bad rap for always being self-centered, but it's like it did happen differently here.
It was a whole different experience.
It was a whole different experience, and even New Yorkers, as tough as we are, we kind of just act like this thing didn't happen. You know, you mentioned 9/11, but like we acknowledged 9/11. Like, we talked about it, we memorialized it, you know, It was on the news. We could actually say 9/11 and not be shadow banned and things like that.
We want to post this on the internet, and we're like, can we even say the word?
Yeah.
Without being censored in some sort of way?
Every conversation that we've had since this has happened, the pandemic has an effect in it somehow. And we can't even put our flyer up. 3 years later, we want to have a public, free conversation about this, and we can't even say the words. We got to manipulate, you know, what is weird.
And which is why we're having this conversation, because we need to. Somebody needs to have this conversation, and we're kind of in the business of having these difficult conversations, and so here we are today.
Yeah.
So,
and in further reflection, right? Because talking about where we were, and we were just, I remember just as you were, and thinking about what was the first thing that happened, right?
First thing you thought about.
What was the first thing that you thought about when, wherever you were in the world, that you heard things were going to be different, right? Whether it was a pandemic, whether you heard COVID, whether you heard quarantine. Supplies, right? That was the first thing that we thought.
The grocery stores are all being emptied out. The toilet roll paper rolls are all gone and sold.
Remember that? Fighting for toilet paper?
We're all going to be having extreme
Why, as a society, are we
know.
trying to act like we weren't fighting for toilet paper?
We were fighting for toilet paper.
During a global crisis.
Yeah. The one thing that really stood out to me, and I think we kind of had a little bit of a, I don't know where, like this, almost like a, I don't know, premonition of around protection, right?
Yeah.
And so what does protection look like with this pandemic where everyone's, essentially contagious? And so PPP was a real big thing back then, right? Getting protection, having enough supplies, and who was going to get that? So there was already a shortage of masks and gloves, and there was this understanding that they were all going to go to our essential workers who were in the medical field, which, understandably so, but then also for us, we kind of were like, wait, what about the rest of us? And what about?
And this was an immediate shortage.
Shortage.
This happened very quickly. This shortage happened in a few days.
Yeah, like we didn't even have time to think, right? And we're like, well, what about the Uber delivery guys who are still out there now delivering our groceries, delivering our food? The postman that's still out there delivering our mail every day. And so, it's really a chance for us to kind of like think about what we could do with our community and collaborate, because we're still gonna have to make things work, right?
Yeah. And at the heart of what we do is empathy, and I don't think we thought about it as empathy at the time, but to reflect on it, that's what it was. Like, we immediately started thinking about other people. We thought about ourselves, our family, naturally keeping ourselves safe. My mom was working in the hospital at the time, so you immediately start thinking about stuff like that. But our work as Iron Perspective is and always was about the people. So we started thinking about how can we help and how can we help protect our local, folks.
I had a hot tip for sanitizer. Where, we didn't have sanitizer. People were making sanitizer at home and like burning themselves.
Bro, this city turned into real Gotham. You think like New York is right now is shady, but like the underground sanitizer game, the getting fabric and man, we felt like we were running boobs back in the 20s. We put
sanitizer off a wedding favor website, okay? Because
everywhere else
this hot tip was like, that's the only place that it's available, like the stock of wedding favors.
Yeah.
And that's how we were able to get a hold of these little, Iron Perspective little hand sanitizers.
We'll put these close up.
That we were handing out like it was liquid gold at the time.
Look at this tiny little bottle, man. This was liquid gold at the time. This is an artifact.
So we couldn't get the regular masks that we now just easily see thrown about on the streets.
Yeah,
and we had to figure out cloth masks, right? And I kind of want to bring that up because we've seen some crazy things. We laugh about it now, but at the time, people were coming up with all sorts of ways to protect themselves.
Remember that? The spacesuits, the helmets, people had the bags.
Right, bras on their face.
Bras, brassieres and all that, underwear and everything.
Yeah. We were fortunate enough to have an amazing community member. She's a bridal seamstress who agreed to essentially sew masks for us, right? So we were sourcing the fabric, going to Joann Fabrics, finding the elastic that was also very hard to come by.
Yeah, that was in short supply.
Yeah, and figuring out how to create these masks.
And what else was in short supply?
I wish we had one in front of us right now, but...
Yeah, right. I know there's some of it, but another thing that was in short supply that you would never ever think of was sewing machines. So when we started gathering this, we're thinking, okay, now
we have people who know how to sew.
We know people who can sew. We can get the whole community involved. If people are in their homes, we can get the products to them, and everyone can do their part to help make these masks. And we couldn't find sewing machines. There were no sewing machines anywhere in the whole country.
We were running a whole mask ring.
We did. We started up real quick too.
Going in and out from the Bronx. We were out here in Queens.
We taking smuggle runs up to the Bronx. We come out. She come out with the fabrics.
I'm like sourcing fabric. I'm like, oh, they have it here in this location. We can go here.
We have some pictures we'll throw up on the screen as well now.
And they were beautiful masks. I'm not even gonna lie.
Yeah. And a lot of this podcast today was one to reflect, but also when we reflect on it, we think about what we created, what we were able to be a part of, how that's a part of our work, you know. All of this was always about the people in the community, and we got to see the community step up.
It really was a very beautiful time, right? People were stepping up in all ways. A lot of people were donating food, figuring out how to help in various ways. Like, it was a beautiful time in New York City, and outside of New York City as well, right? Where people were really showing up for each other.
And that's what we mean by reflection too, and we'll ask you that as well. Share some stories with us of positivity that happened. What positive happened in your neighborhood, in your area? Because neighborhood became a thing. It became a thing very quickly. If everybody's home, then what's going on in your immediate neighborhood becomes way more important. What's going on in your local supermarket is way more important when everybody is at home.
While we're talking about the pandemic, and I know we just mentioned quarantine, right? What's the difference, would you say, between quarantine and the pandemic? I mean, besides being locked up versus not, like, what's the...
Well, the pandemic to me is the whole thing, right? Within the pandemic, you have the actual virus, which again, if we say it, it's like they'll throw lightning bolts at us. And then an element of the pandemic was some cities went into quarantine where there were strict restrictions. You couldn't do this. There were only a certain amount of stores that were open. They didn't give us a curfew in New York. I don't think they wanted to force their hand, but if nothing was open.
But everyone was inside though. Everyone who shouldn't be outside was inside. And we know this. We have some pictures.
Right. I was going to say we'll share some pictures of what the city looked like. And we got to go out, man. We were really outside. Now then, everybody was talking about we outside. We were really outside, man. Got to see the city.
Yeah, we were outside, not playing around so much as we were outside.
Yeah, you just got to be outside.
Yeah.
There were times where you could hear the birds in New York on the highway. You could drive, you could hear it. It was amazing.
You never see those streets that empty again, I'll tell you that.
It took about 2 or 3 days before the sky cleared up. These are things people don't talk about too. My friends in LA, they said that as well, that the whole sky was the clearest that they've ever seen the sky. It looked picturesque over here.
It really was. It was a beautiful time. I mean, despite what was going on. There's always two perspectives to things, right?
What about that question for you? What the difference between the two?
I mean, the pandemic is obviously the overall larger thing, and maybe the cause of the quarantine. The quarantine was this unique period of history that I think really needs to be captured. The before and then really the after, right? Because once we were all allowed to come back out again, right? People didn't. It wasn't this oh yeah, let's all come back out.
For a while.
It created all these issues, mental health issues in people, right? People are afraid. When you come out, now you have to interact with others again. All of those idiosyncrasies, right? It's all before. It was a very clear, there was before quarantine and then there's after quarantine.
Right.
And how we relate as people is it's a whole different experience.
when you talk about that experience within quarantine, you know, or people interacting, thinking about how we did so much, you know, so we went from the radio station and in public. We had several public events, in-person events, before the quarantine happened for us in New York. And then we immediately switched to virtual events. And there was no blueprint, right? You know, nobody said this is what you do when everybody's inside, and we just started mulling our ideas.
I mean, we're in the space of conversation, right? And
we knew we wanted to have conversations.
Especially now more than ever, right? And we have to figure out virtual, we have to figure out Zoom. All of a sudden, everyone was figuring out Zoom. Shout out to Zoom.
Shout out to Zoom.
If we could get some advertising here, that'd be great.
Shout out to Zoom. Zoom might have saved the world. Zoom and Versus.
For real. Oh, that's a whole other.
Timberland.
But Zoom gave people a way to connect with each other face to face. People still need to connect. Like, I was lucky. You know, we're lucky when you're not quarantined by yourself, like completely by yourself, right? And so many people were by themselves for weeks at a time, no touch, no other voice, nothing.
Months at a time.
Months at a time.
We talked to a lot of people in the different events that we did, and they were at home by themselves. They had been by themselves for a while.
And even if you're not, right, like, there's conversations. People need to socialize, need to be in connection with others. And so we found a way to really shift our work to meet the needs of our community, growing our community as well, because we definitely got a lot of new followers during that time.
Shout out to all of our quarantine family.
Yes, we hope to see you next week on our.
That is the thing. The pandemic really expanded our audience to nationwide. You know, so that's been amazing.
Yeah, we had our serious conversations, of course, around the state of the world and what does this all mean. But then we were also having some fun, right? Like, our first real event was our Netflix and chat. When we shut down, what were we all watching? We were watching a lot of TV. Netflix really became a big thing.
We watched Tiger King as a community.
Tiger King, yes.
We all
the nation was mesmerized with Tiger King. Like, what is going on while we're locked up at home? Who's this guy?
We've been in a place where we don't really judge society as individuals, but also as a company. Like, we just kind of come to society where they're at, and that's where we were at that time. Everybody. And so we not only watched it, but we watched it together, and we had conversations around it.
You know? Yeah, really. I mean, it sounds like, oh, well, what about Tiger King we're speaking about? But all of our conversations really does have a point, right? It's the sociology behind how people are thinking and how they're viewing things and reacting to things.
Yeah, and there's a space for gossipy talk, and, you know, this one shouldn't have done that, but, you know, there's also a space to watch Tiger King and get some real life.
Why are we so fascinated? Like, yeah. We also did the platform, which many of you may remember.
Yeah, check that out if you haven't seen it.
That was before Squid Games, right? But that was a whole concept in itself about how humanity deals with things. I also got to have maybe my first and only quarantine birthday. I'm a tax day baby, and we were still in the midst of quarantine during that time, and that was a very special birthday.
Shout out to all the quarantine babies.
Yeah.
And everybody who had their birthday. I mean, I inevitably did, but, you know, it was probably a year into it. Your birthday was
and real shout out to quarantine babies, like babies who were raised during quarantine. I have a nephew, and he wasn't one yet, but he was essentially raised and grew up during quarantine time. And, you know, there's a funny, like, joke that goes around. Quarantine babies are different. They grew up differently, right? They had a whole different, they were more or less inside, you know? So that's a whole thing.
That's just one aspect of this conversation. You know?
All the things have changed.
Right. We're running through the things that we did, and, you know, some of the things that we also wanted to talk about on this podcast, but just consider the quarantine babies, the people who were by themselves during quarantine, the parents, and the education. We didn't even touch on that yet, but this is why this conversation is important to us.
Also, we were having a lot of conversations, right? We were having our chats and convos, but we were still having I Am Perspective podcast. We were having a lot of conversations with a lot of different essential workers, our everyday heroes who were out there doing the work, supporting them.
Yeah, we got to talk to nurses, doctors.
We had doctors reaching out to us. We were kind of like mini journalists, I would even say, during that time, right? Because we were having conversations in spaces that they were not having in the mainstream, right?
Yeah, we talked to principals, teachers, bus drivers, candid workers. Like we definitely had a lot of conversations.
Yeah, and asking the questions. We were talking to kids, right? Like who are experiencing this pandemic and this quarantine in real life, where their whole lives, like if it's difficult for adults, can you imagine how it is for kids? And having the space to talk to kids.
And imagine them looking at us like, why are we not talking about this? If they don't have a space to talk about this, and we're not creating any kind of space because we're just trying to get to the next thing.
Yeah. I Am Perspective became I Am Protected for a little while. As we were doing all these initiatives, right? We were having our conversations, we were working on the PPE, right? We were sourcing food for people. So, you know, while we were physically donating, you know, delivering potatoes, we also knew that there was ways of using our community to connect people to the resources they needed. And so spending a lot of time during that time just connecting people to resources.
I was doing that just in this building. You know, we're all been cordial in this building, but I would just drop bags of food off at people's, and at one point you catch somebody, they're like, hey, is that you? You start a conversation, then you find out what I'm dropping off to them is going to their extended family or something. So there was a lot of that happening.
Yeah, it was a very amazing time in many ways.
And this is the same place. We're not just lamenting on old times. Like we know
this wasn't even that long ago.
Yeah, right. Like this wasn't that long ago. We were really just officially out of this thing for maybe a year upcoming. And this is the same city that came together. We watched this happen 20 years ago with 9/11. We talk about these major events for this city.
Yeah, and we're nationwide and worldwide. We're reflecting specifically on New York City, but this is not a conversation that's limited to New Yorkers. I'm sure this was happening nationwide. We know there were a lot of people who were looking to support New York during this time as well. So
yeah, and these effects happened everywhere. I believe everywhere in the country had to be inside for some portion. So what we're talking about with our students here is certainly reflects on wherever you're at.
Yeah. There was this nice period of time, I think, and then it started getting a little kind of crazy, especially when these vaccinations started coming out. And it became mandatory to get these vaccinations, and all of a sudden I feel like it started turning into this like me against you, or like us against them, like based on who's pro-vaccination team and who's not. And even that was very murky, right? Because are you really pro-vaccination if you're getting it because you feel like you have to, so you can keep your job, so you could go outside again, so you could travel, so you could do whatever, right?
You just bringing that up just makes me just there's a lot of sociology to unpack with these events. And again, I do think we consider ourselves historians in some ways, whether it be our work or photography, or we're both writers. And so we're looking at this differently, and we watched all of this stuff that we just talked about: empathy, humanity, community. All of it went away immediately when the vaccinations became a conversation.
Survival of the fittest.
Right.
Or something.
It was we were pit against each other for the concept. We're not even going to talk about what we feel about it or what it doesn't even matter. It's just what we saw happen. You know, people went from outside of fighting for toilet paper and that ridiculous type of stuff.
Yeah. And then trusting, like, who are you trusting? Are you trusting Fauci? Are you trusting Trump? Are you trusting it was a whole conversation. And
you have people I know that would say they would go to their family's house and not be let in because of their choices. So you're having a family split, you're having cultural differences.
And now here we are. And
and now here we
What's your status? I don't know, because my thing already expired or whatever. We're not talking about it.
What does that relation look like? Like a year and a half ago, you wouldn't let your cousin in because of this thing, and then now nobody's got a mask on. We're all good.
So that's all. We can spend hours and hours, I'm sure.
That is a
just
totally
but
separate podcast. And I think that will serve us more with with different guests. What you're used to seeing us when you go back and check our old shows and podcasts is that we did this to share perspectives. And so we've interviewed a lot of people.
And we will be having many guests on the show.
Yeah. Normally we'd have 2, 3, 4 other people in here, but we wanted to re-kick things off for this new season with some personal shares from ourselves.
Yeah, and really just what we've noticed, and we get to hear a lot of perspectives. So some of it is ours, some of it's stuff that we've also heard and absorbed, and that makes sense.
Yeah, but you'll be seeing a lot of just our perspective.
And then we're gonna be touching on a lot more stuff. I feel like there's so much to talk about. Trump and unemployment. Spend hours on that. I don't even know if we need to get into that.
All these buzzwords that we put into this video. I don't even know if we could put this up. And we didn't even curse. Isn't that crazy?
We did curse.
But we used all the curse words.
Another significant shift that we saw around this vaccination time is really one of the reasons we even started I Am Perspective in the first place, right? Is race talks, right? As just coming out the quarantine, this was a huge conversation. We were talking about Black Lives Matters again, right? And then Asian Lives Matters, and then LGBT lives, and any other life you can think of.
And any and every life that you can think of. Mm-hmm. And all these lives matter now, and yet we still seem more divided than ever.
Yeah.
We've made a declaration that everybody's life matters, and here we are.
Yeah. This is really a start of when we started taking our work, besides just having these conversations, but really taking what we've learned, our own personal development and professional development, and created our first workshop, which is how to be an ally. Really going into biases, privilege, your circle of trust, who are you talking to, right? And so there's a lot to uncover, and that's some of the work that we do with our workshops and trainings, which you can find out more about through our website, www.imperspective.com. Information will be on the bottom here as well. Yeah.
And that's where we are. We took all of that, we turned it into wine. We've taken an amazing pivot from this pandemic. We've survived. So if you're watching this, kudos to you. You made it.
You made it, yeah.
And we talked about doing this show and what it would be and what this conversation, because we have some pieces that are going to follow this podcast, some write-ups, some blog posts, some videos and so forth. And not to berate the topic, but we have to talk about these things, and we have to address and give space.
Yeah, we talk about it because we need to talk about it, but also what you said earlier, that we are historians, and if it's not going to be us, then who, right? Who's going to write about this time period and our own experiences, right? We get to be proactive about actually, right, creating the narrative and the stories that we want to say. So 100 years from now or whatever, some kid's not reading about how easy this was, or they just erase all of this, right? Yeah. That's why this is so important.
And you were here, you were there, wherever you were at, your story matters. We'll be talking a little bit more about our plans of further documenting this. We're not going to let all the cat out the bag right now, but we're asking these questions even in this video because a lot moving forward for us is engaging with our community and sharing this work. We know so much about this work, and we've learned so much individually and together as a unit in a business and a company. And we have such an outstanding community that we invite more people to. So if you're seeing us on YouTube or you're seeing us for the first time, please like, share, and subscribe to our channel for more of this amazing content.
And then join us at our events. We have our Pandemic Perspective, April 5th, 2023. You're more than welcome.
You see how you whispered that? It was a subconscious
April
thing.
2023.
You can't even say it in the recording. It's like, come out April to our pandemic. We're having a discussion on the reflection of the pandemic.
Everything we kind of touched on and more.
Yeah. So we'd love to hear from you. We'd love to hear your experience and your perspective. Come out and join us for this event and every event moving forward.
Thank you for joining us again.
Peace and love. We out. Deep inside, deep down inside. Deep inside, deep.